everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the 10 Chapters Apart podcast. I'm one of your hosts, Steven.
I'm the other host, Jason.
Yes. And we kind of just we had a bunch of ideas running through our heads, and this podcast is sort of just going to be us and possibly guests talking about like whatever we're feeling about talking about this week. Kind of. We just had thought that there were some themes in Christianity that maybe don't get discussed a lot, or maybe are more pertinent to like the world right now, and the topics don't necessarily get covered. And so we just thought, as we were talking, we were just like hanging out one day and just thought of the idea, like, oh, what if we had a podcast? Especially since right now with the whole coronavirus and everything, everyone's at home, so everyone's looking for like more media to get a hold of. Just thought it'd be kind of cool, right? That's kind of how it went.
Yeah, I think so. I think it started as like a joke, since Epic Thursdays look a lot different now. Our weekly college student gathering, now that it's virtual, one of the ideas we threw out was like, oh, hey, Steven, what if we have like the Epic podcast? But since Epic Thursdays have continued as normal, then we get to do this on the side, which is really cool.
Yeah, and just like I guess a little bit introduction, if you're watching this and you have no idea who we are, we're just two college students, Christian, and we wanted to kind of build this podcast to talk about things maybe that you would not necessarily hear about so much from a Christian perspective, and just kind of like share our perspectives. We're just like normal people, both going to classes and trying to learn about God and learn about how God affects our life.
For sure. And being in a college ministry, and especially with so much turnover and like lots of new believers coming in all the time, I think we tend to stay, I don't want to say on the surface level, but we tend to talk about a lot of topics that are the most like applicable for people who are like earlier in their walk with God. So we talk a lot about things like unity and service, and how to love your brothers and sisters better, how to honor God. But we'll be using this time to talk about things that we don't normally talk about, either more niche topics or maybe some of the things that are harder to talk about in large groups, and so we can discuss them here. But our first topic for this podcast is talking about the walk of someone who grew up Christian. And I think this is an interesting topic because a lot of times I think we focus on the people who discovered God in a really radical way. Like anytime we're listening to a testimony, we love to listen to the testimonies where there's
like the crazy testimonies.
Yeah, just a crazy testimony.
Oh, like I was like a drug dealer. I was like this and that, and then my life changed.
I went through great pain or great trial, and then here's me before God and here's me after God, and there's so just this huge dichotomy, and that shows us just like how real God is and how much of an effect He has.
But those are cool. I mean, like those are the ones like you listen to and you're like, whoa, this is crazy. God is crazy.
Yeah. But then there's the other side of Christianity. I think that there's a lot of people who grew up Christians. Stephen and I both grew up Christian, and a lot of people in our college ministry grew up Christian as well. And I think there's always this looming question of like is my faith real? I kind of just like grew up into this, and so today we're going to be talking about the fact that like even if that's you and you don't have the crazy testimony, like you still have a story, and we're going to work through some of those things together.
Yeah, and just as a disclaimer before we go into any of the future podcasts, like even though some of the people watching us will know that we're both leaders in Epic movement, that the things that we say here are not like the opinions or of Epic movement at all. Like we're just talking, and we just wanted to get stuff out, and so don't take this as like, oh, Epic's podcast. No, no, no. It's just it's our little podcast called 10 Chapters Apart.
Yeah, definitely. And we might explore some interesting theology. So
Yeah,
that's
some
important to
touchy.
know.
Yeah.
But yeah, so Stephen, to start off, since we're both in that boat of growing up Christian, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess my family has been Christian or like has believed in God for a while. My mom, when she came to the U.S. around the age of 8, um, her family, they started going to this church because had they had like some English teaching, I think, and then from there, she learned about who God was. And I think it was around like middle school age where she accepted Christ. And then from my dad's side, his parents, so my grandparents on my dad's side, came to know God in Malaysia. And then both of them became actually ministers or evangelists around the Southeast Asia area. So when my dad was born, my grandparents were already pastors there. And so when my dad and mom met, and since I was born, I've been going to church like basically as long as I can remember. Like even before I can remember, basically, because I would they would take me to this like really small church, and I'd play in the nursery with whoever was taking care of me there. And yeah, so it's been like every Sunday I've been going to church, even when I've moved around. So I've moved around to a couple of places in my life, but we've always found a church and always been going there Sunday. And that's why I guess right now in the whole coronavirus situation, it definitely feels weird to not be going to church on Sunday because it's been
Mhm.
such a regular part of my life. But yeah, so have been learning about God ever since. I think I made it really a part of me very early on, mostly because I had a really good church family growing up. I had really good brothers and sisters that were older than me in the church that just took care of me and made me have so much fun. So I never was really too doubtful, and everything that I learned about the Bible and what God was saying kind of really made sense for me. And I definitely was the kind of person that always tried to dig deeper, especially when um, I would be given some kind of questions by non-believers and say, "Well, why is your faith like this? Why is your faith like this?" It's a tough topic, and I would go and try to find answers to it. And so I guess I would say that my faith has been pretty strong ever since I was really young.
Mhm. Yeah, that's cool. And I think that's,
Is it
I don't
similar
know,
for you?
a little bit. I don't know. I think that's cool that your faith was always so strong, because I don't know if that's true even of everyone who grew up Christian. I know that like I'm that way, that I wasn't super strong until I got to college and experienced like the fellowship. But yeah, uh, both of my parents grew up Christian. Both of my grandpas actually are pastors, so that like Christian influence is pretty much everywhere in my family, even extended family. It's just everywhere. So that's just like the environment I grew up in. Same as you, I've been going to church since I was in diapers. Um, you know, I've had an interesting experience with churches growing up because um, we had to move churches a lot. I've lived in the same neighborhood my whole life, but I've gone to several different churches, and for various reasons, like churches splitting, um, churches kind of losing steam due to having like a small body, um, and just like trying other churches to figure out what community was best. But yeah, I always grew up Christian. My parents are strong believers, and uh, not the same as you. I never really had a community of believers with me growing up. I knew other people who were believers, but I wasn't in any sort of like youth group or any sort of community of believers my age. Which actually, it's kind of amazing that I was able to stay Christian. Um, thinking about it, it like must be because of God, of course, but also like the strength of my parents as believers and the way that they raised my siblings and me, and then also like extended family. I feel like whenever we had extended family gatherings, God was always like very much a part of that process, and seeing how much joy and stuff there was there, and attributing that to God, I think helped me stay faithful. But I know I would have sort of like faith conversations sometimes with other people, and especially like my friends who are huge into the science thing, trying to disprove me, and then I would say no, this is
Yeah.
this and that. um, but yeah, I guess I was sort of a rule follower growing up. I don't know how strong my faith was though, but
Hmm.
when I got to college, it definitely took off after that.
Yeah, I guess I want to like maybe ask a bit more because I know a lot of people that have grown up in Christian families and just kind of been like, oh yeah, that was maybe I went to church when I was young and then I kind of didn't really care for it or it wasn't really my thing. But I think it's really cool that you kind of even if you didn't have a really strong community around, still was managed to stay in God. And then, so I guess like, why do you think that there are some people that maybe grew up Christian and then didn't find it their thing or didn't want to stay in the faith, whereas like you were still holding firm?
Mm, yeah, that's a good question. um, Yeah, going back to my parents, I think they did a really good job of of helping me understand why we follow God. I think there's something to be said for the way that like living for God influences your actions, and I think that God has wired us so that making the right choice that's within His will, it um, it feels good to serve Him, you know. And so I think that there are a lot of times when there were things that I wanted to do, but my parents had taught me that, like, yeah, I guess had just like instilled in me that like God's will is the most important. And even when I think I wasn't personally close with God growing up, I still understood His role in my life as like the sovereign creator, and the fact that I needed to keep Him in perspective when I was making decisions. And I think that for other people, uh, when when church day is compartmentalized on Sunday, then Monday through Saturday, like, am I still thinking of God when I'm making this decision? No, I'm not. I'd rather do something that I want to do, and I think that's one of the big things is um, God. I think God was always at the center for me growing up, even when I wasn't like in my Bible or praying daily. I think He was still there in the center of like my decision making processes and all of that.
Yeah, I feel like the same. For me, I feel like it is a big part of my parents. Just kind of seeing that whatever actions that they took or decisions that they made were really to follow God. And so, like, I saw in my parents' life that they truly um, wanted to find out what was the right thing to do, what was the godly thing to do, and made a lot of decisions based on that. And so, maybe for some people, where yeah, like you said, church is just something you go to on Sunday and then afterwards it's like not really a part of your life, then it can become hard to stay a part of a faith which just seems like oh maybe just a ritual or a tradition that needs to be followed rather than a lifestyle that needs to be lived out. And so I think I would credit my parents as well for kind of being that. And I think it like raises a good point that for if you're watching this and you are a Christian, it's kind of there's a lot of effect on like what happens now and all the way into the future. So whether you're like planning to get married or dating or having kids in the future, like how you um, treat your kids and how you raise them and how you live out your life now, how you're following God now, like that's going to be seen by your kids in the future. Um, Neither of us have kids, but like I know that um, I was greatly impacted by the decisions that my parents made, and it definitely helped to play into how I was able to stay faithful to God, or how it shaped my view of God, even the way my parents were.
Yeah. And I know one thing that I forgot to mention is that like my parents, they they always trusted in God when making their decisions or when things got hard. Especially when we were younger. I know that my parents didn't always have a lot of money, but they always trusted in God, and God always provided. So I think it's cool to see those things as you're growing up. And like, you know, we were talking about people who have these wild testimonies, and they are you know, someone who was like spiritually sick and received the cure and got better. um, and I think that's true of us too, but at the same time, I think you can, even if you were never so like spiritually sick, that God was like completely out of your life. Maybe if you grew up in that, like, you don't I you don't need to be sick to see what the sickness is and to know that you want to stay healthy, you know.
Yeah, it's like kind of touching on the topic of, well, I know there are a lot of people that would come up to me and just be like, "Oh, well, like you've just been a Christian your entire life. Like it's easy for you because your parents were Christian." Or like, how is it that I'm supposed to believe something when it just seems hard to understand? Like if I've never grown up in a Christian family, how am I supposed to believe that? Like you're only believing it because that was what you were taught since when you were young. Like, what would you say to someone like that?
That's a tough one. And it's especially tough when people talk about people from unreached people groups or from the other side of the world that grow up in other major world religions. Like, like, how is that fair that you get to be born into Christianity while they have to discover it on their own, or from some great evangelist? But um, yeah, addressing that, I really strongly believe that no one inherits their faith. I think I know that this is true for me. I'm sure that this is true for you, Stephen, and hopefully for everyone else who's chosen to walk with God, even if they have grown up Christian. But I think that there's always a moment where you decide for yourself to follow God, even if you prayed the sinner's prayer when you were 5. I did that with my mom, which is kind of crazy to me that I made such an impactful decision to that would like radically change the course of my life, even before I could understand the gravity of it. Um, but there, I think there's also a point where you really truly in your heart choose God, and that happens whether you've grown up Christian or if you haven't grown up Christian. And so like, honestly, thinking about it, if you grew up Christian and that's the reason why you have your faith, or like that plays a great part, then like thank your parents for that. For thank your parents for like evangelizing to you as a child and living that out in front of you.
Yeah. Um, it's definitely hard, I feel like, for that question. It's I've definitely known people that have grown up in Christian environments that have walked away from God, and definitely people that have not grown up in Christian environments that have found God and wanted to pursue God, even though their family wasn't. So I definitely agree that God gives each person the opportunity to follow Him, and that at some point it comes down to you just having to make a choice of whether or not you want to follow God. And for some people, I guess in a maybe a harsh way, like it isn't fair. Like for some people, it definitely is a bit harder to reach the gospel, or harder for them to just encounter a community where they can really see God's love on display. Um, but I don't think we're all kind of, I guess, born with the same playing field. I think there are definitely differences in how, like, where we're born, the environment that we grew up, the situation that we were given, and it does make it hard for some people to come to know God. Um, but that's all like part of the challenge. It's like the this analogy, like for example, if you grew up in an environment where like your family was or your parents were alcoholic, it is like statistically more likely that you will also be an alcoholic when you grow up, just because it's past like the genetics, is passed from the home environment as well, that you'll be more susceptible to alcoholism. But that doesn't mean that you also don't have the same opportunity to make that choice to choose alcohol or to choose to not be an alcoholic. And so I feel like it's very similar thing for Christianity. It's like you may not necessarily be born in an environment that like fosters the Christian faith, but at some point you have encountered it. And if you were given a choice whether you want to accept or reject the idea, and I think if you really wanted it, you could pursue it forward and could like look into God and see whether this God is really the God of this world and a God that you want to follow. But it is definitely hard. Like I understand the struggle for people. It's hard because everything in this world, it just keeps on moving forward. Like you're constantly looking for what's going to happen next. Like you're from K through 12 school, from high school, you're trying to figure out what college to get into, and from college you're focusing all on your job and on whether you want to go to grad school and have a family and things like that. And it's hard to think about this kind of idea of God that seems so maybe not, there's not a specific time and place for it in our lives. It's like much broader on the time scale.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think you brought up some really good points. The first one, just briefly, like people walk away from Christianity. It's not like I was born into a Christian family, and so like I get to go to heaven automatically. I think that's a good point that people walk away from it, and that really like clearly demonstrates the idea of choice. Is that in seeing people walk away, that I think is a very clear indicator that there is a choice. And if you grew up Christian, this is important. If you grew up Christian, uh, having done that doesn't mean you have a relationship with God. You still have to choose God as well. You know, um, yeah. And then the other one being like the whole playing field thing. I think that's so interesting. Um, yeah, because we know that God is just in His decision, um, when it's time for God to either open the gates to you, or um, if you did not choose Him, and that means you go to hell. Um, but everything before that, I pretty firmly believe that like our worldly circumstances, God does not choose to be fair in what He gives us in a worldly way. Some people grow up comfortable. I think both of us grew up pretty comfortable. Some people have poorer financial circumstances. Some people grow up in bad home environments, and even like not worldly things. I think God chooses to have some people grow up in more spiritually poor environments too. So like you were saying that you grew up in a community of believers. I know that you went to like a lot of the like Theophilus retreats in high school, which is really cool. And then I didn't really get that growing up. So that's like an example of like um, that wasn't fair even between the two of us. Like how spiritually rich our upbringing was. Um, but yeah, the choice is so important, and I love this one verse that you shared last term at Epic, and it was Romans 1:20, which says like the creation of the world has been clearly seen, and uh, it's been understood what's been made, so that men are without excuse. And so I think it is really important that you bring up that everyone does have that choice. And when we who have grown up Christian make that choice, I think that's like we got a little bit of like we got a little bit of a head start from God. He very clearly set the choice before us, and then it was ours to make. But even for others who don't, I think He's always going to set that choice before them and allow them to choose Him, and then it's up to the person from there.
Yeah, I think we can too often get into the trap of um, blaming our circumstances. I definitely understand that, like if you grew up like in a terrible environment, if you grew up like just not having basic needs or things like that, your circumstances it's hard, and I understand. I feel for you, but like Jesus just asks people to choose him, not depending on like where they came from, whether they were religious or they're not religious, whether they're just if they were uh, on the like the Sanhedrin, or like whether they were fishermen, or whether they were prostitutes or anything like that. Like he just asks people to follow him, um, from all kinds of backgrounds. And so I think that, yeah, that's like you're given the choice, and you can choose to follow Jesus and follow God, or you can choose not to. And that same choice is given to you whether you come from a stable financial background or a stable spiritual background, or if it's an unstable financial background, unstable spiritual background. Because I think Jesus and God really transcends all of those kind of barriers that we might see.
Earlier we were talking about like the crazy testimonies, and I think one of the coolest things about all of those things is like the contrast that we see between this is me before God and this is me after God. So then when we talk about people who grew up Christian, and I think a lot of us were rule followers growing up. Like these are the rules, we're going to follow them because that's what God wants us to do. But again, there's a time when we all make a choice. So how would you speak to like how do I know that my faith is real even though I don't have that contrast in my life?
Ooh. I think it's definitely a tough question. I know this kind of relates to, I remember when I was like growing up, and sometimes, or even right now in our fellowship, there be people who are asked to give testimonies. We're always looking for people to share their testimonies in our large group meetings, just to um, it's nice to know people's stories. And I always felt like, I mean, like I grew up Christian, and I don't really have like a good like testimony story to tell in front of everyone, because it's going to be kind of boring. It's going to be like, oh yeah, I became a Christian when I was young, like the end. But wait, so what was your question again? Sorry.
How do I, so when I don't have the contrast, I grew up Christian, and at some point I chose God, but like when outwardly there's not a huge contrast between before and after, like how do I still know that my faith is real? How do I know that it's my
I mean, I don't think you need to have the big contrast to know. I think, at least for me, when I'm just like studying the world, and studying the way that people live their lives, and I observe how this world is going on, and I look at the way that God has written in his book, and God has written in the Bible, and I see the things that he's put into place, and I see also um, like the values and the kind of love that he's shown, and I like compare it to the way I see the world, and I find that it matches up. And like, even though I didn't see maybe necessarily like the dark sides, and then be able to have that change, I don't think it puts you behind to have always been following your entire life. um if we look back into like the Old Testament, the people that have been like following God, the Israelites, like they've been strong in their faith and firm in their faith for a long time. And I think even as like next generations and next generations come, they learn about God from their parents. And so no matter like what worldview you're brought up in, you're given a worldview that's kind of as your basis, right? Like right now, I guess in school, most people learn that like, oh, if you can't observe it with science, if you can't study it, um, then it's you should go out and try to study it and then make your decision based on that. or like I guess agnosticism is agnosticism is kind of like the foundation for a lot of people right now, because that's just what's thought of to be as like, oh, the baseline. Your baseline is you know nothing, you know that there's no God, um, you don't know whether there is God or not, but then when you make the choice, that's you choosing to follow God. But I think that that baseline can shift. It doesn't have to be that you start out agnostic. Like the baseline could be, oh, you start off and everyone is shown that God exists. And I think that it's very clear, like if we look throughout a universe, that it's clear that there are signs that God exists from the way he changes people's lives, from the way creation has been made. It's just uh, very obvious that there is a creator. So there, that could be the baseline, and then your choice could be to choose to not follow God. What I'm saying is that, like, I don't think growing up in a Christian environment diminishes from the fact that you love God and that you are following God and that you believe the things that God has said are true. Just because you've never experienced other religions, or like dabble, I guess, like tried out other religions to see whether they are true or not. Like I know from reading the Bible and from the reading the works of like other great theologians and other great philosophers, C.S. Lewis especially, who didn't grow up Christian, but then as he learned and studied the Bible, found that God was real and that all the things made sense to him. Um, so it's like, yeah, I guess my train of thought is coming to a halt right now, but I guess that's yeah. I think you definitely can still claim to be a Christian and still claim to be a follower of God, even if you've not necessarily experienced the hardships that come from not following God. You know,
Yeah.
and maybe that gives us even more of a challenge. Like we're given such a gift at the beginning from our birth that we're
Hmm.
like placed in a Christian environment. So we have more of the background or the foundation, to which we can go and like spread the word and do more of God's work. And perhaps that's just, we're just given more of a burden in that regards, um, to share the gospel, or to live godly lives because we were given such a gift when we were born.
Hmm. There's definitely a give and take with it. It's like it's a gift that we get to grow up in this environment, and that the opportunity to choose God is so just like obvious and there for us. Um, but you're right. There are issues with growing up Christian that people who come to Christ later in life don't experience, and it's like, yeah, I think mainly just the one we're talking about is like finding God when growing up it feels like he always belongs to someone else. I know that was my experience, is feeling like Christ belonged to my parents, and so the faith that I had was from them. I went to church because of them. Um, but I think when you really do choose Christ and your faith becomes fleshed out, um, like you know it's real when you're uh, like when you want to serve God, when you have like a desire to do that. Because I think, like we know in the book of John, Jesus says like, "If you love me, obey my commands." And um, growing up Christian, if you are a rule follower, you do obey those commands, but it may not necessarily be out of love for God. And I think when you choose God, then it does become an act of love. Um, growing up, it's like it's obedience to your parents more than God. And at that point where it becomes obedience to God, I think that's when you know that your faith is real. And when you like, if you're excited to spend time in the Word, or if you feel like great spiritual yearning to pray at times, um, yeah, I think that when your faith becomes real, you start to take joy in God. You experience joy in like seeing others baptized, or in sharing the Word, and having spiritual conversations. And so even if even if like outwardly your life like wasn't radically changed, or if God didn't like rescue you from terrible circumstances, I think your faith is still real from what's in your heart, and that's something that we can know uh, just in the way that we're feeling in our relationship with God. And I know that it gets hard at times, but just the fact that you want to experience God and that you want to wrestle through things, I think is a really strong indicator that your faith is real.
Yeah, and it's definitely not easygoing, even though you might be born into a Christian family. It's There are definitely times where I've questioned my faith as well. Like I've thought maybe this is all just a big hoax, or like how do I know what I actually believe? And it's in those times of really like struggling through it, wrestling through it, that I think you kind of come to make your faith stronger to yourself, or like you come to believe in God more through like pursuing through those questions and asking those questions. And I don't think that you have to just believe everything just because you've been born into it. There are those times where you have to ask the questions and come to grow in your faith. And it's all about that growth. I think really what God cares about is that you're making an effort, not so much like where you get to, you know?
Yeah.
And this is something like you've told to me before, but it's like if you're starting, say, like not being a Christian or not having a Christian family, and say like in college you become saved, like God really cares that you're just making an effort. And maybe like you're looking at yourself and you say, "Oh, wow, I'm like behind on from the people that were born a Christian, grew up, read the Bible like every week and every day, and understand all this theology and are so good at explaining all these different concepts and things like that. I'm far behind. Like, how am I going to catch up?" I don't think you don't have to worry about really like catching up. Like, yes, definitely put in the effort to learn and grow more in your faith, um, but don't try to compare yourself to people who have been Christian for a really long time and have been following for a really long time. I think everyone's journey is special to themselves, and God really cares that you're just putting your effort in. If you look at that and then you decide, "Oh, that's too hard to get to that point, I don't want to put in effort," then I think that's not right. And I think that's um, that, yeah, you're definitely not going to grow if you don't put in the effort. And God just wants to see you want to grow. God wants to see you want Him.
Yeah, God only I very firmly believe that God only cares about your trajectory. He doesn't really care where you are, and especially he doesn't care where you are in relationship to other believers. Because like, even if my, you know, if my Bible knowledge is like one higher than my peer average Joe, it's like, what does that difference matter when God is like infinity away from me? It's like, okay, what's infinity plus one? It's the same thing. And so what matters is like that trajectory. You're Yeah, I think that's really important to keep sight of. And I was definitely the same way in terms of doubting my faith. One of the things I think that was like a recurring doubt for me is like, what if this whole thing is just clever psychology? What if um, what if I'm doing all this service just to make myself feel good for doing good things? Or what if I'm praying so that I can just like pretend that something else is going to take care of my problems for me? And interestingly enough, the Bible actually addresses those things. Paul pretty frequently tells us that the people of the world will will try to dissuade you from who God is, or they'll chalk all of this religion stuff up to um, we just want something else to take care of our problems for us, or we want to believe that there's something better. And I think that's still true today. But the fact that we wrestle through those questions is really important. Um, one of my favorite one of my favorite things from the book of Genesis is in chapter 32, where Jacob wrestles with God. And Jacob, so he wrestles with God, and God touches his hip socket, and he basically like pops it out, or he injures it somehow. And Jacob's in pain, but he still won't let go of God. He's saying, "I'm not going to let go until you bless me." Um, and God does. And after kind of the fight is over, God renames him Israel, and Israel means he struggles with God. And as we know, Jacob renamed Israel. It's from him that like the 12 tribes of Israel come from. And so it's crazy to me that like God's people bear the name Israel, which means he struggles with God. So it's like God's people, God wants us to wrestle with him. And
Yeah.
if we cling to him and we say like, God, I'm not going to let go until like we get through this together. I'm not going to let go until you bless me. I think that God is faithful to honor that.
Yeah. Um, yeah, definitely. I totally agree with all of that. Like, I guess I also didn't really think about that so much until you just brought it up. Like, yeah, the Israelites, the God's chosen people, were named for like he wrestles with God or he struggles with God, and that's like so cool. It's not just supposed to be like he blindly follows God no matter what.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
it's like, yeah, really like searching for God. And I think throughout the entire Bible, you have all these characters that are like strong, um, godly people that still wrestle with God. King David, for example, like he, if you just read through Psalms, which I've been going through recently, it's like it's not uh, all happy times. It's not good. He's like crying out to God because there are people attacking him and things like that. And he's trying to figure out why God is putting him in these situations and things like that. And throughout the Bible, like so many different people who question God. And this having been just like Easter weekend, I was going back and my YouTube recommended, for some reason, there was a lot of Prince of Egypt clips. So I went back and I was reading Exodus, and like Moses, who's known for bringing people out of Egypt, like he's the guy. Like everyone references him in the New Testament. All the Pharisees, like, oh yeah, is this Moses? Blah, blah, blah. The guy, when he met with God in the burning bush, he was like, who am I to bring these people out? Like, what am I supposed to do? I'm not a good talker. I can't do any of this. I don't know what to do. And God is just like, no, I am God, and I will help you get through this. I think it's so cool that, yeah, it's not, we don't have to be perfect going into knowing God. We can still struggle and figure out these questions, and God will be there to help us through it if we really do want to look for Him.
Hmm. And I think if you're insecure, maybe not sure, not super confident in like your Bible knowledge, or really any aspect of your faith, I think as long as you want God and you're taking steps to pursue Him, that's the important thing. Like you mentioned Moses, who is not confident in himself, and God used him to to bring the slaves out of Egypt. And um, in First Corinthians, Paul says like God didn't choose the wise or the strong. He chose um, people of humble origins, people who weren't the smartest or the wisest, in order that through them his power would be displayed, saying like, I can use even these to accomplish like my will. And so I think that's important. Like if we have confidence and it's not from God, um, that's kind of a problem, because that's not really what God's looking for. God's looking for people who have like a humble and willing spirit that he can use, as long as we trust in him.
Yeah. So, I think we've kind of covered this topic for a while. It's been around 40, almost like coming up on 45 minutes.
Oh wow. I was hoping to keep it at a half hour.
Yeah. Well, this is like pretty good. And I guess definitely like for you listening in, this is, again, we're just discussing things between the two of us and sharing the viewpoints that we have. Like if you have any of your own viewpoints or discussion, like I definitely welcome it. I don't want this to be a place where we're just straight up like telling you, oh, this is it. like, this is how we see Christianity. This is how we view God and the things that he's written in his Bible. And if you disagree, if you have a different perspective, definitely, like, you're free to write it in the comments. If you know us personally, you're welcome to message us about it. But yeah, we just wanted to come here and deliver you some of our thoughts. And yeah, I guess we'll try to make this, we're looking to make this a weekly thing. Is that right?
Yeah, but no promises. Yeah, Steven's got an internship. We're both taking classes right now, so hopefully weekly. I think we'll be able to carve out time, but don't come at us with pitchforks if something doesn't pop up on a certain week. But yeah, so we've got a few topics already that we're thinking of discussing, but also if you guys have ideas of things that you'd like us to discuss, we would welcome those suggestions too. And if we think if we can make the topic interesting enough to listen to, then that's definitely something we would consider.
Yeah. We've also got some, or at least one person lined up to possibly join us for one of these podcasts to share a little bit of a different perspective. But if you're interested in joining and like sharing about a topic, yeah, feel free to reach out to us. I will try to put some kind of form or something in the description of this video so that you can have some response or mention if you're interested in joining us. But I guess with that said, we will see you next week. And yeah, this has been 10 Chapters Apart.
Happy Easter, guys. See you guys later.
See ya.